That colt was worth more than the widow's entire life, one of the ranch hands whispered the night the storm rolled over Vale Ranch. Rain hammered the barn roof hard enough to shake dust from the beams while lightning flashed across the valley in long white scars. Inside the foaling stall, the mare trembled against the wooden rails, breathing fast, wild-eyed, steam rising from her body into the cold midnight air. Harrison Vale's finest breeders stood ankle-deep in wet straw, their sleeves rolled high, their faces tight with the kind of fear men carried when money and pride started slipping through their fingers. "She's turned wrong," one of them muttered. "Colt's stuck." Another bolt of thunder rolled over the hills. Somewhere outside, horses cried out nervously in their pens. The old ranch clock inside the main house struck midnight, slow and hollow. Harrison Vale never heard it. The millionaire rancher slept beneath thick wool blankets in the largest house for 50 miles, unaware that the bloodline he had spent 12 years building was dying inside his own barn. The unborn colt inside that mare carried the future of his ranch. If it survived, buyers from Denver and Cheyenne would line up by spring. If it died, the bank waiting quietly behind Harrison's debts would finally close its hand around everything he owned. Men knew it. The ranch hands knew it. Even the stable boys understood enough to stay quiet that night. Another painful cry came from the mare, softer this time. "Weak." One breeder stepped back first. Then the other followed. Neither looked proud about it. "Nothing more we can do," one finally said, pulling off his gloves. "Sometimes the good Lord says no." The word settled heavily into the stall. The mare lowered her head, exhausted, sides shivering beneath the lantern light. Rainwater leaked through cracks in the roof and dripped steadily onto the wooden floorboards. And standing just outside the half-open barn door, unnoticed by almost everyone, was Eleanor Whitmore. The widow kept her gray coat pulled tight against the cold wind. Her boots were worn nearly smooth at the heels, and strands of silver hair clung damp against her cheeks. Most men on the ranch barely looked at her anymore. To them, she was just the quiet widow who repaired torn saddle straps behind the old storage shed and kept mostly to herself. Some called her cursed after her husband died beneath a frightened horse 6 winters earlier. Others simply pretended she wasn't there at all. But Eleanor heard every sound inside that stall. The mare's breathing. The nervous shifting of boots. The defeat hiding beneath the breeders' voices. She also heard something else. A faint scraping movement from inside the mare that made her eyes narrow slightly beneath the lantern glow. One breeder noticed her near the door and sighed tiredly. "Barn's closed tonight, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed fixed on the mare. The animal's ears twitched once toward her voice before settling again. Outside, wind swept across the valley carrying the smell of wet cedar, mud, and distant rain. Then Eleanor finally spoke, quietly enough that the storm nearly swallowed the words whole. "That colt's still fighting." The breeders exchanged exhausted looks. One gave a humorless chuckle. "Maybe. But fighting ain't always enough." Eleanor's eyes never left the mare. Somewhere deep in the stall, beneath the fear and thunder and failing hope, she recognized a rhythm she had not heard in years. And for the first time that night, the widow stepped forward into the light. Eleanor Whitmore had not touched a foaling rope in almost 7 years. Not since the winter morning they carried her husband home wrapped in a canvas tarp with snow frozen into his coat. Men around Vale Ranch still spoke about that day in lowered voices, usually when they thought she was too far away to hear. They said the horse had panicked. Said Samuel Whitmore had slipped in the mud trying to calm it. Said grief had hollowed Eleanor out afterward like rainwater carving through soft earth. Maybe they were right. Because after Samuel died, the widow stopped speaking unless necessary. Stopped attending church socials. Stopped lifting her eyes when people passed her on the street in Blackwater Creek. She simply worked. Quietly. Patiently. Like someone trying to survive one winter at a time. The little shed behind the old stables became her whole world. Saddle straps hung from nails beside cracked harness leather waiting to be stitched. Lantern smoke stained the ceiling black. In the evenings, the smell of oil, horsehide, and cedar shavings drifted through the open doorway while Eleanor sat bent over her work beneath weak yellow light. Some nights she earned barely enough for bread and coffee. Other nights she earned nothing at all. Still, every morning before sunrise, she walked the ranch perimeter alone carrying a small tin bucket of oats for the older horses nobody rode anymore. The animals trusted her. More than most people did. Harrison Vale noticed that once. Nearly 3 years earlier, he had stepped from his carriage outside the main barn just as Eleanor calmed a nervous gelding nobody else could shoe. The horse had nearly kicked 2 ranch hands already. Yet the moment Eleanor rested her hand against its neck, the animal stilled like water settling after wind. Harrison had watched silently for a few seconds before walking away without a word. That was his way. The millionaire rancher spoke little unless money was involved. Men respected him because he owned nearly 12,000 acres across the valley and employed half the county during cattle season. But nobody truly knew him. Harrison Vale carried himself like a man permanently braced against disappointment. Tall. Sharp-featured. Always dressed cleaner than anyone else on the ranch. Even his boots seemed untouched by dust somehow. Since his wife died from fever 8 years earlier, the ranch had become the only thing he cared about. Some said he loved horses more than people. Watching him move through the stables, Eleanor sometimes believed it. Another cry came from the mare inside the stall, pulling Eleanor back into the storm-soaked present. One breeder wiped rainwater from his forehead and shook his head again. "We should let her rest," he muttered. "Pushing harder will only make things worse." Eleanor stepped closer to the stall gate. The mare's chest heaved heavily now, nostrils flaring in panic beneath the lantern glow. But Eleanor's attention fixed lower. On the angle. On the tension beneath the animal's belly. Her father had taught her long ago that horses spoke before they suffered. You only had to listen carefully enough. Amos Whitmore had been one of the finest horse breeders west of Missouri before whiskey and bad investments ruined him near the end. Men used to travel 200 miles for his advice. Eleanor spent her childhood beside birthing stalls instead of school desks, holding lanterns while her father worked through freezing nights exactly like this one. She remembered every lesson. Even the ones she tried hardest to forget. Another bolt of lightning flashed through the barn slats. The mare stumbled weakly sideways. One ranch hand crossed himself quietly beneath his breath. And then Eleanor saw it. A tiny movement beneath the mare's flank. Small. Wrong. But alive. The movement lasted less than a second, but Eleanor saw it clearly beneath the lantern light. One small hoof pressed wrong against the mare's side, trapped at an angle no healthy birth could survive for long. The widow stepped fully into the stall then, ignoring the wet straw soaking through the hem of her skirt. One breeder opened his mouth to protest, but something in Eleanor's face stopped him. Calm had settled over her suddenly. Not confidence exactly. Something older. Something buried deep beneath years of silence and grief. The mare tossed her head nervously as thunder rolled over the valley again. Eleanor moved closer anyway, slow enough not to startle her. Her fingers brushed lightly along the horse's neck, damp with sweat and rain mist. "Easy now," she whispered. The mare's breathing eased by only a fraction, but it was enough. Horses remembered gentleness faster than people did. Behind Eleanor, the breeders exchanged uncertain looks. "Miss Whitmore," one said carefully, "this is no place for guessing." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She crouched beside the mare instead, studying every shift of muscle, every strained breath. Her father used to say a horse told the truth with its body long before disaster arrived. Men ignored those warnings because panic was louder than patience. Eleanor had not forgotten. She reached for the lantern. Hanging nearby and lowered it closer to the stall floor. Shadows stretched long across the wood planks while rain rattled against the roof overhead. Then she saw it more clearly. The colt was twisted sideways. Not dead. Trapped. One breeder rubbed a tired hand across his jaw. Even if you turn it, the mare is too weak now. Another nodded toward the main house visible faintly through the storm-dark window. Mr. Vale already paid enough trying to save this one. The words lingered heavily in the air. Paid enough. Eleanor understood what they meant. Harrison Vale had spent nearly $18,000 importing bloodlines from Kentucky and Virginia after the drought ruined most local breeding stock. Men laughed at him for it at first. Called it vanity. Then buyers started arriving from across the territory offering impossible amounts for his horses. That changed everything. Success usually did. But success also made men desperate to protect what they built. Especially when it started slipping away. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, knees stiff from years of hard work and cold mornings. Go get fresh water, she said quietly. The breeders blinked in surprise. What? Fresh water, Eleanor repeated. And clean towels. Not the dirty ones hanging by the door. One ranch hand hesitated before finally hurrying out into the storm. Another remained rooted near the stall gate. You really think this can still work? Eleanor glanced toward the mare again. The animal's sides trembled heavily now, exhaustion pulling at every movement. The widow knew the truth already. This birth sat balanced on the edge of failure. One wrong movement could cost both lives. But she also knew something else. Horses often survived because one person refused to quit before dawn. I think, Eleanor said softly, that mare is still trying. Outside the barn, wind swept hard across the valley carrying the distant creak of loose fence posts and the smell of soaked earth. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote cried into the darkness. The sound made one stable boy near the doorway shift nervously. Mr. Vale is going to lose his mind if this colt dies, he muttered under his breath. Eleanor heard him. Everyone did. But the widow's eyes never left the mare. Because for the first time in years, she felt something she thought had disappeared forever. Purpose. Dangerous thing, purpose. It could wake ghosts a person spent years trying to bury. Another sharp breath escaped the mare. Eleanor set the lantern down beside the stall gate, rolled back her sleeves slowly, and stepped deeper into the straw. The storm deepened after 1 a.m. Rain struck the stable roof in hard sideways sheets while cold wind slipped through every crack in the barn walls. The lantern flames flickered low, throwing nervous shadows across the stall. Eleanor knelt beside the mare with both sleeves rolled past her elbows now, her hands steady despite the years between this night and the last difficult birth she had touched. The mare shifted anxiously beneath her breath, muscles tightening in painful waves. Easy, girl, Eleanor whispered again. Do not fight it. One of the breeders returned carrying fresh towels and a steaming bucket of water. He stopped short when he saw Eleanor already working beside the animal. Not guessing anymore. Working. The widow's face looked different now under the lantern glow. Focused. Younger somehow. Like the storm had stripped away years instead of adding them. Hold the light lower, Eleanor said without looking up. The breeder obeyed before realizing he had done it. Outside the stall, 2 ranch hands stood shoulder to shoulder watching in complete silence. Nobody laughed at the widow anymore. Not tonight. Eleanor studied the mare carefully for another long moment. Then she closed her eyes briefly, listening. Her father once told her that panic made people deaf. Calm let them hear the small truths hidden underneath fear. She listened to the breathing. To the timing. To the movement trapped beneath strained muscle and exhaustion. Then her eyes opened sharply. The colt is turned sideways, she said quietly. One shoulder first. The younger breeder frowned. That cannot be fixed without losing one of them. Eleanor reached for the clean rope lying beside the bucket. Only if you rush. Another low cry escaped the mare, weaker now than before. Time was slipping away. Everyone inside the barn felt it. The stable boy near the doorway swallowed nervously. Should we wake Mr. Vale? Nobody answered him. What good would that do? Harrison Vale could buy land, cattle, bloodlines, even politicians when needed. But money had never once convinced nature to obey a frightened man. Eleanor looped the rope carefully through her hands, testing the tension the same way her father taught her decades ago. Slow. Gentle. Never against the animal. Always with it. Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of her old gray hat onto the straw below. I need the mare standing, she said. One ranch hand blinked. Standing? She can barely stay upright now. Eleanor finally looked at him directly. Then help her. The men moved immediately. Quietly. Carefully. Together they steadied the exhausted mare while Eleanor guided the rope with patient precision. The younger breeder watched her hands closely, confusion slowly turning into disbelief. Where did you learn this? He asked softly. Eleanor did not answer. Because the truth sat too heavy in her chest tonight. Her father used this same technique during a blizzard outside Wichita 30 years earlier. She remembered standing beside him holding a lantern while snow buried half the stable door. Remembered his rough voice saying something she hated him for at the time. A horse does not care if your heart is broken. It still needs steady hands. Eleanor understood those words now more than ever. The mare stumbled once, nearly collapsing. The stable boy gasped. But Eleanor stayed calm. Not yet, she whispered softly to the animal. Stay with me. Lightning flashed white through the cracks in the barn walls. For one brief second every face inside the stall glowed pale beneath the storm light. Then came the sound. Small. Sharp. Barely there. But unmistakable. A faint kick from inside the mare. Alive. One ranch hand let out the breath he had been holding for nearly an hour. The younger breeder stared at Eleanor in stunned silence now. Because for the first time all night, hope had entered the barn again. And hope could be a dangerous thing when dawn still felt very far away. By 2 in the morning, the storm had settled into a cold steady rain that wrapped the valley in darkness thick as smoke. Water dripped from the rafters in slow uneven rhythms while the lantern beside the stall burned lower with every passing minute. Eleanor could feel exhaustion pressing against the mare now. The animal's legs trembled harder each time another contraction came. One breeder shifted uneasily beside the gate. She cannot keep this up much longer, he said quietly. Nobody argued with him. Even the stable boy understood what was happening. Hope had entered the barn again, yes. But hope could disappear fast when nature decided otherwise. Eleanor wiped rainwater and sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. Her fingers ached from holding tension against the rope for so long. Still, she did not stop. She watched the mare carefully between every breath. Waited. Listened. Her father taught her that rushing a frightened horse only invited disaster. Patience was harder. Patience demanded trust. Another sharp movement came from inside the mare. Stronger this time. Eleanor adjusted the rope slightly, her jaw tightening in concentration. That is it, she whispered softly. Come on now. The mare suddenly lurched sideways against the rail with a frightened cry. One ranch hand grabbed the post to steady himself while another nearly dropped the lantern. The younger breeder swore under his breath. We are losing her. Eleanor's heart stumbled painfully at those words because for one terrible second she thought he might be right. The mare's breathing had turned ragged now, desperate almost. And beneath the fear rising through the barn came another feeling Eleanor had not expected tonight. Doubt. Dangerous thing, doubt. It slipped into a person quietly after years of failure and grief, whispering old wounds back to life. Eleanor remembered another storm. Another stable. Another horse screaming in panic while Samuel Whitmore tried to calm it alone. She remembered the awful silence afterward. The snow. The men avoiding her eyes when they carried his body home. For years she blamed herself for not stepping inside that stable sooner. Tonight that memory wrapped around her chest like barbed wire. Her hands froze for half a heartbeat. The mare stumbled again. "Miss Whitmore," the stable boy whispered nervously. Eleanor looked down at her trembling fingers. Old scars lined her palms from decades of ranch work. She suddenly felt every year of her age beneath the lantern glow. Maybe the breeders had been right earlier. Maybe some things could not be saved once they started slipping away. The younger breeder lowered his eyes quietly. "We can still stop before the mare collapses entirely." Eleanor did not answer. Outside, wind moved through the valley grass with a low mournful sound. The barn creaked softly around them. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled weaker now, moving east toward the mountains. The storm was leaving. But dawn remained hours away. Then something unexpected happened. The exhausted mare turned her head slowly toward Eleanor and pressed her damp muzzle weakly against the widow's shoulder. Not fear. Not panic. Trust. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Horses remember gentleness faster than pain. Her father used to say that too. When she opened her eyes again, the doubt was gone. "No," she said softly. "We are not stopping now." She handed one end of the rope carefully toward the nearest ranch hand. "When I tell you, pull steady. Not hard. Steady." The man nodded immediately. Nobody questioned her anymore. Eleanor stepped deeper into the straw beside the mare once more, lantern light flickering across her tired face. Then she whispered something almost too quiet to hear. Not to the men. Not even to herself. To Samuel. "I stayed this time." The barn had grown strangely quiet by 2:30. Not peaceful. Just heavy. Like every man inside was afraid to breathe too loudly and break whatever fragile chance still remained. Rain tapped softly now instead of roaring, and somewhere water dripped steadily into a metal bucket with hollow little echoes. Eleanor stayed kneeling beside the mare, one hand resting gently against the animal's neck while the other kept tension on the rope. Her shoulders ached fiercely. Her knees burned against the soaked straw. But she ignored both. Pain was easier to carry than regret. The mare shuddered beneath another contraction, weaker than before yet somehow more controlled now. Eleanor felt it immediately. The colt had shifted slightly. Not enough. But enough to matter. "Now," she said calmly. The ranch hand holding the rope pulled carefully, exactly as instructed. Slow. Steady. No panic. The younger breeder lowered the lantern closer, eyes fixed on Eleanor's hands with growing disbelief. He had spent nearly 10 years working ranches across Kansas and Wyoming. Yet he had never seen anyone move with such patience during a difficult birth. Most men fought problems. Eleanor listened to them instead. Another tense moment passed. Then another. The stable boy near the door suddenly whispered, "I think I saw movement." Nobody answered him because everyone saw it. A small shape shifted beneath the mare again. Stronger this time. The colt was turning. Hope moved quietly through the barn after that. Nobody spoke it aloud. Men on ranches rarely trusted hope enough for words. But shoulders eased slightly. Breathing slowed. Even the exhausted mare seemed to sense something changing around her. Eleanor leaned closer toward the animal's ear. "That is it, girl," she whispered softly. "You are doing fine." Outside, clouds drifted slowly past the moon, letting pale silver light slip through cracks in the barn walls. The storm was finally moving away from the valley. Cold air followed behind it carrying the clean smell of wet pine and earth. For the first time all night, Eleanor noticed how quiet the ranch house stood in the distance. Harrison Vale still slept through everything. The millionaire had no idea a forgotten widow was kneeling in freezing straw trying to save the future of his ranch with a lantern and a rope older than some of his workers. Strange thing about life in the West. Sometimes the people holding everything together were the ones nobody bothered seeing. Another contraction came suddenly. Stronger. The mare cried out sharply and nearly dropped to one knee. The stable boy panicked. She is falling. No, Eleanor said firmly. Hold her steady. The ranch hands moved immediately, bracing carefully against the mare's shoulders. Eleanor adjusted the rope once more, every motion precise despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. Then she felt it. The colt had finally turned enough. One front leg moved into place beneath the mare. Properly this time. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly in relief. Good, she whispered. Good. The younger breeder stared at her openly now. How are you doing this? Eleanor's face remained calm beneath the lantern glow, though tears threatened quietly somewhere deep behind her eyes. My father used to say horses only trust people who leave their pride outside the stall. The breeder frowned slightly, trying to understand the meaning. But Eleanor was already focused again. Because the hardest part had not arrived yet. The colt still needed strength to survive the rest. And the mare had almost none left. The lantern flame flickered hard as cold wind pushed through the barn. Shadows jumped across the walls. Then came a sound so small most people would have missed it entirely. A faint wet gasp from the colt inside the mare. Alive. Truly alive. The stable boy covered his mouth in disbelief. One ranch hand muttered a quiet prayer beneath his breath. And Eleanor Whitmore, the widow everyone once called cursed, finally allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope. 3 o'clock came quietly over Vale Ranch. The storm clouds had drifted east toward the mountains now, leaving behind a cold silver fog that rolled low across the valley grass. Inside the barn, the lantern burned weak and thin, its flame shrinking lower with every passing minute. Nobody had spoken much during the last half hour. There was nothing left to say. Men only watched. Waited. Hoped carefully. The mare stood trembling between the wooden rails, sides heaving with exhaustion. Steam rose faintly from her damp coat into the cold air while Eleanor remained beside her, one hand resting gently against the animal's shoulder. Her clothes were soaked through. Straw clung to her sleeves and hair. Her fingers had gone stiff from cold and strain. But she still did not leave. Another contraction rolled through the mare slowly this time. Different now. Controlled. Purposeful. Eleanor saw it immediately. Light closer, she whispered. The younger breeder obeyed without hesitation. Lantern glow spread lower across the stall floor, and for the first time all night the stable boy gasped openly. A tiny hoof had appeared. Properly positioned. One ranch hand removed his hat quietly, almost like he had just stepped into church. Nobody moved after that. The mare pushed weakly again. Then stopped completely. The silence that followed felt endless. Eleanor's heart tightened hard inside her chest. The colt had come this far only to stall again. The mare lowered her head heavily, breathing shallow now. Too shallow. The younger breeder swallowed nervously. She is spent. Eleanor already knew. Every second mattered now. She crouched lower beside the mare, listening closely to the breathing inside the stall. The colt still moved faintly. Alive. But weakening. Come on now, Eleanor whispered softly. Do not stop here. Her voice carried no panic. Only gentleness. Outside the barn, dawn still hid beyond the horizon, but the world had begun changing colors. Black sky slowly softened toward deep blue beyond the stable doors. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed once into the cold morning air. The sound felt strange after such a long night. The stable boy glanced nervously toward the ranch house. Should someone wake Mr. Vale now? One ranch hand shook his head slowly. Not unless there is something worth showing him. The words settled heavily into the silence. Because despite everything Eleanor had done tonight, nobody knew how this would end. Hope could still vanish in the final moments. It happened every day on ranches across the West. Men learned not to celebrate too early. Eleanor looked toward the fading lantern beside the stall gate. Oil nearly gone. Dawn approaching. The mare barely standing. Strange how life often balanced itself on the smallest things. One flame. One breath. One more push. Then the mare suddenly shifted again. Harder this time. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. Now, she said firmly. The ranch hand tightened steady pressure on the rope while the mare strained with the last strength left inside her exhausted body. For one terrible second nothing happened. Then came movement. Slow. Wet. Impossible. The colt began sliding free into the straw. The stable boy covered his mouth with both hands. One breeder whispered, "Dear Lord." Eleanor barely heard either of them. She focused only on the small trembling shape lying motionless beneath the lantern glow. Too still. Far too still. Nobody breathed. The mare turned weakly toward her newborn, nostrils flaring anxiously. Eleanor moved instantly, kneeling beside the colt despite the sharp pain in her knees. Her hands brushed carefully along its neck, clearing straw away from its nose. "Come on now," she whispered again. "You fought too hard to quit now." Silence filled the barn. Cold. Heavy silence. Then suddenly the colt shivered once beneath her hands. Small. Barely noticeable. But alive. The tiny shiver passed through the colt like the first spark inside dying embers. Small. Weak. But enough to change the entire barn. The stable boy let out a shaky breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. One ranch hand whispered another prayer beneath his breath while the younger breeder stared at Eleanor as though he no longer understood who she was. The widow barely noticed any of them. Her hand stayed gently against the colt's neck, rubbing warmth back into the trembling body while the mare lowered her head protectively toward her newborn. "That is it," Eleanor whispered softly. "Stay with us now." The colt twitched again beneath the lantern glow. Then came the faintest sound. A wet uneven breath filling tiny lungs for the first time. The entire stall seemed to exhale together after that. Not celebration. Not yet. Just relief. Quiet and careful. Eleanor reached for one of the clean towels and began drying the colt with slow steady motions. Her arms ached fiercely now. Every muscle in her back burned from hours kneeling in wet straw. But exhaustion could wait. Dawn was beginning to creep faintly across the eastern horizon outside the barn doors, painting the foggy valley in pale gray light. The storm had finally passed. Only dripping rainwater remained. The younger breeder crouched nearby, still watching Eleanor work. "I thought you said you stopped doing this years ago." Eleanor kept drying the colt without looking up. "I did." "Then how did you remember all of it?" That question lingered between them for several seconds while the colt struggled weakly to lift its head. Eleanor's hands paused for the briefest moment. Some memories never really left people. They only went quiet until something called them back. "My father made certain I would not forget," she said at last. The breeder lowered his eyes slightly after that, understanding enough not to ask more. Across the stall, the mare nudged her colt gently with her nose, encouraging movement. Instinct. Life pulling itself forward one breath at a time. Eleanor watched carefully. He needs to stand before sunrise if he is going to keep his strength. The stable boy blinked nervously. Stand. Already? Eleanor nodded once. Colts are born running from danger. Nature does not give them much time. The boy looked down at the fragile animal uncertainly. The colt's legs seemed impossibly thin beneath its damp coat. Weak things rarely survived long winters out west. Everyone knew that. The younger breeder leaned back against the stall rail slowly. Mr. Vale is never going to believe this. At the mention of Harrison Vale, the barn grew quieter again. Strange how one man's name could change the air around a room. Outside the ranch house, no lights burned yet. The millionaire still slept peacefully while his entire future balanced shakily on 4 newborn legs inside a cold barn 50 yards away. Eleanor wondered briefly what Harrison would say when he finally saw the colt alive. Probably nothing at first. Men like Harrison Vale carried gratitude awkwardly. Success had taught them to trust transactions more than kindness. But horses understood things differently. The mare certainly did. She stayed close beside Eleanor now, calm despite the long terrible night behind them. Animals always remembered who stayed. Another few minutes passed quietly. Then the colt suddenly gathered its legs beneath itself awkwardly and tried to rise. The stable boy gasped. One leg slipped immediately, sending the colt back into the straw. Eleanor stayed calm. Again, she whispered gently. The colt tried once more. Trembling. Struggling. Refusing to quit. Dawn light slowly spilled deeper into the barn as the colt fought toward its feet. And standing there in the fading lantern glow, Eleanor Whitmore realized something she had not felt in many years. The emptiness inside her chest no longer felt quite so empty. The colt failed twice before the sun reached the horizon. Each attempt ended with trembling legs slipping helplessly against the wet straw while the stable boy winced like he felt the fall himself. But the third time was different. Eleanor saw it before anyone else did. A little more strength in the shoulders. A little more stubbornness in the movement. Life had finally decided to stay. The mare nudged her newborn again with soft restless breaths while pale dawn light spread slowly through the barn slats, turning the darkness silver and blue. The lantern beside the stall finally gave one last weak flicker before dying completely. Nobody bothered relighting it. Morning had arrived. The colt pushed upward once more. Front legs first. Then the back. Trembling violently the entire time. One ranch hand removed his hat again, this time without even realizing it. The younger breeder leaned forward against the stall rail, hardly blinking. Slowly, impossibly, the colt stood. Weak. Shaking. Unsteady as fresh-cut timber in high wind. But standing. Silence swept through the barn after that. Deep silence. The kind that only arrived when men witnessed something they knew should not have happened. The stable boy looked ready to cry. One breeder let out a quiet laugh filled more with disbelief than joy. Eleanor stayed kneeling in the straw beside the colt, breathing hard now that the long night had finally loosened its grip around her chest. The mare lowered her head protectively over both of them while sunlight crept farther across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the ranch slowly began waking for morning chores. Somewhere beyond the barn walls came the distant sound of cattle lowing and wagon wheels creaking through wet mud. Ordinary ranch sounds. Yet inside the stall, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The colt took one awkward step forward. Then another. Its legs wobbled dangerously beneath its narrow body, but it refused to fall again. Eleanor smiled faintly despite the exhaustion burning through her bones. "That is it," she whispered softly. "You keep moving." Her voice cracked slightly on the final word. The younger breeder heard it. So did the ranch hand beside him. Because for the first time all night, the widow no longer sounded like a ghost wandering through old grief. She sounded alive. The stable boy suddenly glanced toward the ranch house visible through the open barn doors. Thin smoke had begun rising from the chimney now. Mr. Vale is awake. Nobody answered him immediately. The men inside the stall exchanged uncertain looks instead. Strange thing about powerful men. Even good news could make people nervous around them. Harrison Vale expected perfection from everything he owned. Horses. Land. Workers. Himself. Few people ever saw softness in him anymore. Success and loneliness had worn most of it away over the years. Heavy bootsteps finally sounded across the muddy yard outside the barn. Slow at first. Then faster. Harrison Vale appeared in the doorway moments later wearing a dark wool coat thrown hastily over his night clothes. His boots were unlaced. His hair still carried the roughness of interrupted sleep. But the moment he stepped inside the barn, he froze completely. His eyes locked onto the colt standing beside its mother. Alive. Harrison said nothing. The younger breeder swallowed hard beneath the silence. One ranch hand lowered his gaze toward the floorboards. Even the stable boy stopped breathing for a second. Because everyone in that barn understood exactly what the millionaire rancher had expected to find this morning. A dead colt. A failed bloodline. Another expensive dream slipping into the dirt. Instead he found Eleanor Whitmore sitting exhausted in the straw beside the future of his ranch. Her hands were stained with mud and birth water. Her gray coat hung damp around her shoulders. Strands of silver hair clung loose against her tired face. She looked nothing like the forgotten widow men barely noticed around town. Harrison stared at the colt for another long moment before finally speaking. Quietly. Almost. Carefully. Who saved him? And for the first time in years, every eye inside the barn turned toward Eleanor Whitmore. For several long seconds, nobody answered Harrison Vale's question. Morning light spilled through the barn doors now, pale and cold against the wet wooden floorboards, while the colt stood trembling beside its mother like a miracle too fragile for sound. Eleanor remained seated in the straw, exhausted beyond words. Her shoulders sagged beneath her soaked gray coat. Mud stained her hands. Damp strands of silver hair clung against her cheeks. Yet somehow she looked steadier than anyone else in the barn. Harrison's eyes moved slowly from the colt to the breeder standing nearby. I asked who saved him. The younger breeder finally cleared his throat. She did. Harrison frowned slightly. She. The man nodded toward Eleanor. Miss Whitmore stayed after everyone else thought the colt was gone. Silence settled over the stall again after that. Harrison Vale looked at Eleanor properly for the first time in years. Not as the widow repairing harness straps behind the storage shed. Not as another quiet worker drifting unnoticed around his ranch. He looked at her like a man trying to understand something impossible standing directly in front of him. Eleanor lowered her eyes first. Old habits. The mare did most of the work, she said softly. Harrison stepped farther into the stall, boots sinking lightly into damp straw. The colt wobbled uncertainly beside its mother but remained standing. Alive. Stronger already than it had been an hour earlier. Harrison stared at the animal with disbelief still visible beneath his normally controlled expression. The breeders told me there was no chance. One ranch hand shifted awkwardly nearby. Nobody wanted to speak against the millionaire's hired men, especially not in front of him. But the younger breeder surprised everyone. We were wrong, sir. Harrison glanced toward him sharply. The younger man swallowed once before continuing. Miss Whitmore knew techniques I have never even seen before. Harrison's eyes returned slowly to Eleanor. Is that true? Eleanor hesitated. Strange how difficult speaking became after. Years of silence. My father bred horses, she answered quietly. Harrison studied her face for another moment, searching memory. Then something changed behind his eyes. Small. Sudden. Recognition. Whitmore, he said under his breath. The stable boy looked between them uncertainly. Harrison took another slow step closer toward Eleanor. Amos Whitmore was your father? Eleanor nodded once. Nobody inside the barn moved after that. Even the horses seemed still beneath the weight of the name. Harrison Vale remembered Amos Whitmore well. Every serious rancher west of Missouri did. The old breeder had once saved an entire line of cavalry horses during a brutal winter outbreak decades earlier. Men used to travel from 3 states away seeking his advice. Then came the drinking. The debts. The quiet fall into poverty nobody spoke about afterward. Harrison looked back toward the Colt standing beside its exhausted mother. Understanding slowly settled across his face like dawn reaching across open land. That turning technique, he said quietly. Your father invented it. Eleanor brushed damp straw from her sleeve tiredly. He never wrote any of it down. The younger breeder let out a low whistle beneath his breath. Suddenly his disbelief from earlier made perfect sense. He had spent the entire night watching a nearly forgotten piece of ranch history unfold inside this barn. Harrison remained silent for several moments longer. Outside, workers had begun moving across the ranch yard carrying feed buckets and saddle gear, unaware anything unusual had happened overnight. Ordinary morning sounds drifted through the open doors. Wagons creaking. Horses snorting softly. Men calling to each other through the fog. Yet inside the stall, something invisible had shifted. Respect. The kind that could not be bought with land or money. The colt stumbled once more beside its mother before catching itself again stubbornly. Harrison watched carefully, then slowly removed his gloves. How long were you in here? Eleanor glanced toward the faded gray sky outside. Since before midnight. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nearly 7 hours. 7 freezing hours while everyone else either slept or gave up. The millionaire rancher looked down at the exhausted widow sitting in the straw beside the future of his ranch. And for the first time in many years, Harrison Vale appeared ashamed of something. The barn slowly filled with morning light as word spread across the ranch that the colt had survived. Men who had gone to sleep expecting loss now drifted quietly toward the stable doors one by one, boots heavy with mud, coffee cups steaming in cold hands. Nobody entered loudly. Something about the atmosphere inside the stall stopped them. Maybe it was the sight of the colt standing beside its mother on trembling legs. Maybe it was Eleanor Whitmore sitting silently in the straw looking more exhausted than anyone had ever seen her. Or maybe it was Harrison Vale himself standing there without speaking, eyes fixed on the widow like he was seeing an entirely different person than the one he thought he knew. The older stable master arrived last. Gideon Price had worked horses nearly 50 years, long enough that his back curved permanently from saddle work and hard winters. He stepped into the stall slowly, removed his hat, and studied the colt carefully without saying a word. Then his eyes moved toward Eleanor's hands. The rope still lay coiled loosely beside her knee. Gideon stared at it for several seconds before something shifted across his weathered face. Recognition. No, he murmured softly. The younger breeder looked toward him. What? Gideon pointed carefully toward the rope setup Eleanor had used during the birth. That is Whitmore work. The barn quieted even further after those words. Gideon stepped closer toward Eleanor now, moving slowly like a man approaching a memory instead of a person. Your father taught you the shoulder turn method himself, did he not? Eleanor lowered her eyes. When I was a girl. Gideon let out a low breath through his nose. I saw Amos Whitmore save 6 cavalry mares during the blizzard of '73 using that same technique. One ranch hand frowned slightly. I thought that was just a story. Gideon shook his head. No story. His eyes stayed fixed on Eleanor. Men came from Texas and Montana just to watch your father work. Harrison remained silent beside the stall rail, but everyone could feel the weight of his attention now. The millionaire rancher had spent years building a reputation across the territory. Yet standing inside that barn this morning, he suddenly realized the quiet widow repairing broken tack behind his storage shed belonged to a bloodline ranchers once spoke about with respect. Strange thing about pride. It often blinded people long before they noticed. The colt nudged weakly against its mother, searching instinctively for milk. Eleanor watched carefully until the mare lowered herself enough for the colt to nurse properly. Only after she saw the newborn feeding did some of the tension finally leave her shoulders. Gideon noticed. "You stayed awake all night making sure they both lived," he said quietly. Eleanor brushed damp straw from her hands. "Someone had to." The simplicity of the answer settled heavily through the barn. Because everyone standing there knew the truth hidden inside those words. Most people had already given up hours earlier. Harrison finally spoke again, voice lower than before. "Why did you not tell anyone who you were?" Eleanor looked toward the open barn doors where pale morning fog still drifted across the ranch yard. "My father died owing half this county money," she answered softly. People stopped remembering the good parts after that. Gideon's face tightened sadly because he knew she was right. The West remembered failure longer than kindness. Harrison glanced around the stall slowly. At the muddy straw. The dying lantern. The exhausted mare. The colt that should not have survived. Then back at Eleanor Whitmore sitting quietly beside them all. "And yet," Harrison said carefully, "none of us remembered the most important part." Eleanor looked at him then, uncertain what he meant. Harrison's eyes moved toward the colt standing stronger now than before. "Your father taught you how to save what everybody else quits on." Silence followed. Deep and honest. Outside the barn, sunlight finally broke across the valley hills in long golden bands. And for the first time in many years, Eleanor Whitmore felt something warmer. Then grief settled quietly inside her chest. By late morning, the rain-soaked clouds had cleared completely from the valley, leaving the ranch washed in cold golden sunlight. Workers moved quietly around the stable yard, but nobody spoke above a murmur anymore. Word had spread farther than Eleanor realized. Men from the north pasture rode over just to see the colt that survived the impossible night. Even the cook from the main house stepped into the barn carrying fresh coffee she forgot to serve because she stood staring at the newborn too long. The colt had grown steadier over the past few hours. Its legs still trembled slightly, but each step carried more confidence now. Life returning. Eleanor remained beside the stall long after the danger passed, watching carefully for any sign of weakness in either mare or colt. Exhaustion weighed heavily behind her eyes. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. Still, every time she tried to stand and leave, the colt would shift closer toward her voice. Horses remembered. Harrison Vale noticed that. The millionaire rancher stood near the stall entrance speaking quietly with Gideon Price while several workers pretended not to listen. "Bank men arrive Friday," Harrison said under his breath. If this colt had died, Gideon nodded slowly. This ranch would have changed hands before winter. Harrison looked back toward Eleanor after that. She sat resting against the wooden rail now, arms folded loosely, eyes half closed from fatigue. Mud still stained the hem of her skirt. Yet the mare stayed calm whenever Eleanor remained near. Even the colt settled easier beside her. Gideon removed his hat thoughtfully. Some people carry away with horses. Amos Whitmore had it. His eyes drifted toward Eleanor. Looks like his daughter inherited every bit of it. Harrison said nothing immediately. Men like him spent years learning how to measure value. Land. Cattle. Bloodlines. Contracts. But sitting there in that quiet barn was something no ledger could explain properly. A woman everyone overlooked had just saved the one thing standing between his ranch and ruin. Harrison reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded stack of bills thick enough to make several ranch hands stare openly. He walked toward Eleanor and held the money out carefully. "For your work." Eleanor looked at the bills but made no move to take them. "Miss Whitmore," Harrison added quietly, that colt is worth more than every horse in this barn combined." Eleanor finally lifted her tired eyes toward him. Then stopped talking about him like property. The entire stall went still after those words. One ranch hand nearly dropped his coffee tin. Nobody spoke to Harrison Vale that way. Not on his ranch. Not anywhere. But Harrison did not get angry. He simply stood there holding the untouched money while Eleanor slowly rose to her feet despite the stiffness in her knees. She stepped closer toward the colt instead, running gentle fingers along the damp curve of its neck. "He survived because his mother trusted somebody to stay," she said softly. "Not because somebody paid enough." Harrison looked down at the money still in his hand. For the first time in years, the bills suddenly seemed very small. Eleanor glanced toward the mare resting peacefully in fresh straw. Animals know the difference. Silence settled across the barn once more. Honest silence this time. Harrison slowly lowered the money without another word. Around them, the workers avoided looking directly at either of them, though every man there understood something important had just happened. Respect could not be purchased. It had to be earned quietly. Usually when nobody important was watching. Eleanor moved toward the stall gate at last, preparing finally to leave after the longest night she had endured in years. But before she stepped out, the colt followed her 2 uncertain steps across the straw. The stable boy smiled openly. "Looks like he already chose his favorite person." Eleanor paused beside the gate, one tired hand resting against the weathered wood. And for the first time since Samuel Whitmore died, a faint laugh escaped her softly into the morning light. 3 days later, the valley finally dried beneath clear autumn skies. Sunlight rolled warm across the hills west of Vale Ranch, turning the tall grass gold beneath the afternoon wind. Workers moved through their chores with the easy rhythm that returned after surviving hard nights. Fence repairs. Saddle leather drying in the sun. Horses watered at the creek. Life pushing forward the way it always did out west. But something around the ranch had changed quietly since the colt survived. Men greeted Eleanor Whitmore differently now. Some tipped their hats when she passed. Others stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. Respect moved strangely through places like that. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Eleanor noticed it most in the stables. Horses that once belonged only to hired breeders were suddenly brought to her for advice. A mare with a swollen leg. A nervous gelding refusing feed. Broken tack nobody else could repair properly anymore. And every afternoon, without fail, the young colt wandered toward her the moment she entered the barn. The stable boy started calling him Ghost because of the pale white marking across his nose. The name stuck. Harrison Vale pretended not to care about such things, but Eleanor noticed he never corrected anyone either. On the 4th morning after the storm, Eleanor walked toward the old breeding barn carrying her usual bucket of oats for the retired horses near the back pasture. Frost still silvered the grass beneath her boots, and cold air carried the smell of cedar smoke from the ranch house chimney. As she rounded the corner toward the stables, she stopped short. Men were gathered quietly near the barn entrance. Gideon Price stood beside them with his hat tucked beneath one arm. Even Harrison Vale was there holding a hammer instead of wearing his usual gloves. Eleanor frowned slightly. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. Harrison simply stepped aside. Eleanor's eyes lifted slowly toward the front of the old breeding barn. A brand new wooden sign hung above the doorway where faded boards once stood empty. Fresh cedar. Clean lettering burned deep into the wood. Whitmore Foaling Barn. Eleanor stared at the sign without moving. Wind rustled softly through the cottonwood trees nearby while horses shifted quietly inside their stalls. Nobody in the yard spoke. Some moments did not belong to words. Harrison rested the hammer against the fence rail beside him. Should have been there years ago, he said quietly. Eleanor swallowed hard, eyes still fixed on her father's name carved into the cedar. For a long moment she could not speak at all. Because after Samuel died, after the debts, after years of being treated like someone life had already finished with, she never imagined hearing the Whitmore name spoken with respect again. The Colt suddenly appeared from inside the barn then, trotting awkwardly toward Eleanor on legs still slightly too long for his body. The workers laughed softly as Ghost pressed his nose against her shoulder searching for oats. Eleanor finally smiled fully this time, warm enough to soften every tired line grief had carved into her face over the years. Harrison watched quietly from beside the fence rail. "Bank men came yesterday," he said after a while. Eleanor glanced toward him. "And?" Harrison looked out across the valley where sunlight stretched endlessly over 12,000 acres of open land. "They offered to extend the loan after seeing the Colt." Eleanor nodded once. "Good news. Important news. But not the most important thing standing in that yard." Harrison seemed to realize that too. He stepped closer toward the